The scent of history was the only air Alara Vance truly breathed. At 22, her world was confined to the small, sun-drenched workspace above her family's failing antique bookshop, a sanctuary of dust motes dancing in the light and the sweet decaying perfume of aging paper. Her slender fingers, stained with the faint residue of ink and restoration glue, moved with the practiced grace of a surgeon over the fractured spine of an 18th-century poetry collection. She was not just mending a book, she was suturing a wound in time, preserving a voice that would otherwise be lost to silence. This quiet, meticulous work was her only escape, a place where she could control the fate of broken things, even as the fate of her own life felt utterly, terrifyingly out of her hands. A profound, unspoken ache resided within her, a void that the stories of others could fill but never heal. If you want to know what shatters this fragile piece, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. We continue. Alara was a creature of soft edges and muted colors, her presence as unassuming as a forgotten bookmark. Her long, dark hair was often tied back in a simple knot, a practical measure to keep it from falling into the delicate pages she worked on. Her large, expressive eyes, the color of moss after a rain, held a deep, observant quality, taking in the world with a quiet intensity that few ever noticed. Living and working in the same cramped building in a forgotten corner of Boston, she was a woman preserved under glass, her life a meticulously maintained artifact. Her profession as a manuscript restorer was less a career and more a calling, an inherited duty to care for the fragile relics of the past, a responsibility that mirrored the heavy, unspoken burden she carried for her family's precarious future, a weight that was slowly crushing her spirit. The silence of her workshop was a deceptive comfort, for within her a storm of quiet desperation raged. She existed in a state of suspended animation, her days dictated by the needs of brittle paper and the hushed, anxious whispers of her parents from the shop below. She felt like a ghost haunting the edges of her own existence, watching others live with a sense of vibrant, messy reality she couldn't comprehend. Every decision, from the clothes she wore to the path she walked, felt predetermined by duty and financial constraint. The future was not a landscape of possibilities, but a narrow, unlit corridor she was forced to navigate alone. This constant, humming anxiety was her closest companion, a shadow that clung to her even in the warm glow of her restoration lamp, reminding her that she was a prisoner of circumstance. Her virginity was not a conscious choice, not a moral stance or a treasured gift she was saving. It was simply a fact, a consequence of a life lived in the margins. It was the result of a profound, almost paralyzing shyness, cultivated by her family's traditional values and the suffocating smallness of her world. Her hands, so confident and skilled in mending the delicate, inanimate sinews of a book, were uncertain and clumsy in the realm of human connection. The idea of a tender touch, of a gaze that saw her and not the duty she represented, was a fantasy as distant and unattainable as the lives of the heroines in the novels she so carefully repaired. It was another layer of her isolation, a quiet testament to a life that had been so focused on preservation that it had forgotten to allow for growth or personal experience. This lack of intimacy carved a hollow space deep within her, a profound loneliness that the company of long-dead poets could not fill. She found a bittersweet solace in their words, in the passionate, tragic, and beautiful lives immortalized on the page. She could lose herself for hours in their stories, feeling their joys and sorrows as if they were her own, because her own story felt unwritten. Or worse, it felt as if it were being written for her by the hands of debt and obligation. The bookshop, with its towering shelves of forgotten tales and silent histories, was a perfect metaphor for her own heart. A place filled with the potential for grand adventure and passionate connection, yet left untouched, gathering dust in the quiet expectation of a reader who might never arrive to turn the first page. Her physical world was a direct reflection of her internal confinement. The cramped apartment was a collection of worn furniture and inherited objects, each carrying the weight of memory and expectation. The air was permanently thick with the smell of leather, wood smoke, and the faint acidic tang of decay that clung to the oldest books. The sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the laughter from a nearby bar, the rumble of the elevated train, filtered through her window like dispatches from another planet, a world of vibrant, chaotic life that she observed but could never join. This stark contrast between the rich, dramatic world she held in her hands and the bleak, colorless reality of her own existence was a constant, painful reminder of everything she was missing, of the life that was happening just beyond the glass. An unspoken dread had begun to permeate the already heavy atmosphere of the bookshop. It was in the growing pile of unopened, red-stamped envelopes on her father's desk, and in the strained, hushed conversations that abruptly stopped the moment she entered a room. It was in the weary slump of her mother's shoulders and the way her father's gaze would drift to the window, lost and vacant. Ilara felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure, a gathering storm just over the horizon. The fragile peace of her sanctuary was becoming brittle, the glass walls of her carefully constructed world showing hairline fractures. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew with a chilling certainty that the silence was about to be broken, and the life she had always known, however restrictive, was about to be irrevocably shattered. The oppressive weight of her family's expectations was a tangible force, as real as the floorboards that groaned under her feet. Dinners were silent, tense affairs, the air thick with unspoken anxieties. Her mother, Martha, would watch her across the worn oak table, her gaze a mixture of love and sharp-edged disappointment. She would talk of the daughters of old friends, their sensible marriages, their secure futures, her words circling Ilara like patient vultures. Each comment was a carefully placed stone, building a wall around Ilara's world, reinforcing the idea that her duty was not to her own heart, but to the preservation of their crumbling family unit. Ilara would simply nod, her throat tight, pushing food around her plate, feeling the crushing pressure to become someone else, someone practical and safe. A carefully bound, easily shelved version of herself that she didn't recognize. Her father, Arthur, was a man slowly being erased by failure. The light had gone out of his eyes, replaced by a permanent, haunted shadow. After the shop closed, Ilara would often hear him moving about downstairs, the soft rustle of papers, the only sound in the deep of the night. On one occasion, peering through the banister, she saw him sitting at his desk, head in his hands, a single lamp illuminating the stacks of ledgers and final notices. He wasn't reading them. He was simply being crushed by their physical presence. The sight carved a new, deeper wound into Ilara's soul. This was not just debt. It was shame. A profound, inherited sorrow. His silence was more damning than any accusation. A constant, quiet plea that she felt powerless to answer, yet utterly responsible for. Martha's campaign to mold Ilara into a more marriageable prospect was relentless and subtle. She would leave catalogs for department stores open on the kitchen counter, pages displaying modest but fashionable dresses, a world away from Ilara's simple, functional attire. She'd suggest new hairstyles, comment on her lack of social outings, and orchestrate accidental run-ins with the sons of acquaintances at the local market. Each attempt was a gentle but firm push towards a life Ilara instinctively recoiled from. For Ilara, these gestures felt like a betrayal. Her mother wasn't seeing her. She was seeing a problem to be solved, an asset to be leveraged. Ilara's quiet resistance, her clinging to her simple clothes and solitary habits, became a silent war fought over the territory of her own identity. The city of Boston itself served as a constant reminder of their social and economic standing. From the window of her workshop, she could see the distant, glittering spires of the financial district, symbols of a world of power and wealth that was utterly alien to her. The bookshop was nestled in a forgotten cobblestone street, a relic of a quieter, less ruthless time. When she walked to the market, she would feel the stark contrast between her world and the one just a few blocks away, where women in tailored coats laughed freely, their lives seemingly unburdened by the quiet desperation that clung to Ilara like the scent of old paper. She was a spectator to life, separated from it by an invisible, insurmountable wall of class and circumstance, her own existence feeling increasingly fragile and insignificant. Her daily routine became a form of self-imposed confinement, a predictable loop that offered the illusion of control: wake, work, eat, sleep. The path she walked from the shop to the bakery, the specific creak of the third step on the staircase, the precise angle of the morning light as it hit the spine of a particular book. These were the constants in a life teetering on the edge of chaos. But this ritual was not comforting. It was suffocating. It was a life lived in miniature, each day a perfect soul-crushing replica of the one before. She was tracing the same lines over and over, wearing a groove so deep she feared she would never be able to climb out. The world outside her small radius continued to spin, vibrant and unpredictable, while hers remained static, airless, and achingly lonely. The unspoken dread finally took physical form one Tuesday morning. A courier delivered a thick, cream-colored envelope, marked with the severe, minimalist logo of Thorne Industries. Her father intercepted it at the door, his face turning a pale, waxy color as he recognized the insignia. He tried to hide it, but not before Elara caught a glimpse of the stark, corporate font. The silence that followed was heavier than any she had ever experienced in that house. Later, she heard her parents, voices from their bedroom, a frantic, muffled argument, the words indistinguishable, but the tone, sharp with terror and laced with a chilling note of finality, was perfectly clear. The storm had passed the horizon. It was no longer coming. It was here, and the walls of their small world were about to be torn down. That evening, her mother approached the subject of marriage with a newfound, desperate urgency. She spoke of Samuel, the son of a local grocer, a kind, stable, and profoundly uninteresting young man. Martha painted a future with him, in pale, sensible colors. A small house, financial security, a life free from the gnawing anxiety of debt. It was presented not as a romantic possibility, but as a pragmatic solution, a lifeboat. To Elara, it sounded like a beautifully decorated coffin. The thought of being bound to a man she did not love, of exchanging her quiet prison for a slightly larger, more comfortable one, filled her with a wave of nausea. It was the ultimate sacrifice, the trading of her soul for their survival, and she wasn't sure she was strong enough to make it. Fleeing to her workshop, Elara sought refuge in her work, her hands trembling as she applied a delicate layer of Japanese paper to the torn page of a first-edition Virginia Woolf. The book's protagonist was a woman who defied convention, who sought a room of her own, a life of intellectual and emotional freedom. The bitter irony was not lost on her. Here she was, preserving the stories of women who broke free, while her own life was being systematically dismantled, her choices narrowing until only one remained. Her meticulous work was no longer just a craft. It was an act of prayer, a desperate plea to the ghosts in the pages, asking them for the courage she so desperately lacked, a strength to face the impossible choice that was hurtling toward her. The Vance family name, once a source of quiet pride, had become another chain. They were people of letters, of history, of a certain intellectual integrity that had no currency in the modern world. This self-imposed nobility was their undoing. It prevented Arthur from declaring bankruptcy, from admitting defeat, from seeking help from those who had long ago adapted to a world he no longer understood. They were sinking under the weight of their own legacy. Elara was expected to carry this burden, to be the dutiful daughter who would quietly sacrifice her own future to preserve the fragile illusion of their family's honor. The moral obligation was absolute, woven into the very fabric of her upbringing, and to defy it would be to unravel not just her family but her entire sense of self. The breaking point arrived not with a shout, but with a defeated sigh. Elara came downstairs late one night to find her father standing in the middle of the darkened shop, a single, priceless, illuminated manuscript open in his hands. He wasn't looking at the intricate artwork. He was staring through it, his expression one of utter, hollowed-out despair. With a slow, deliberate movement, he closed the book and placed it on the counter, his hand resting on the cover as if saying goodbye. He didn't see her standing in the shadows, but she saw the single tear that traced a path through the dust on his cheek. In that silent, devastating moment, Elara knew. The time for small solutions was over. A debt had been incurred that could not be paid with money. It would have to be paid with something far more precious. The man who would shatter her world was named Julian Thorne, a name whispered in the financial districts of the world with a mixture of fear and awe. He was a phantom, a modern-day Midas whose touch turned companies to gold for his own coffers, often leaving ruin in his wake. His domain was a penthouse that pierced the Boston skyline, a sterile fortress of glass and steel where art hung on the walls like captured souls, and the silence was so profound it had a physical weight. From this perch he observed the city below not as a participant, but as a king surveying a chessboard. each light a pawn, each life a potential asset or liability. He was a man who had meticulously amputated himself from the messy, unpredictable pulse of humanity, existing only in the cold, clean logic of acquisition and control. Julian Thorne was a ghost in his own opulent life, haunted by a past that had taught him a single, brutal lesson. Love was a weapon, and intimacy was the wound it created. A long-ago betrayal had cauterized his heart, leaving behind a landscape of scar tissue where emotion could no longer grow. He collected things, rare artifacts, priceless paintings, first-edition books, because they were beautiful, silent, and incapable of deceit. They could be owned, controlled, and understood. People, he had learned, could not. So he moved through the world as a predator, viewing every interaction as a transaction, every relationship a negotiation of terms. His reputation as the vulture was not an insult. It was a shield, a carefully constructed persona that kept the world, and its potential for pain, at a calculated distance. The final notice from Thorne Industries was not a negotiation. It was a death sentence for the Vance family's bookshop. The summons came 2 days later. Arthur Vance, a man who had spent his life in the gentle company of poets and historians, walked into Julian Thorne's office. A place so minimalist and severe, it felt like an antechamber to a judgment hall. There, amidst the silent, accusing gleam of chrome and glass, with the city sprawling beneath them like a conquered territory, her father made his desperate, shameful offer. It was the last valuable thing he possessed, the one thing not yet inventoried or appraised, his daughter. Julian, listening with an unnerving stillness, accepted the terms with the same cold indifference he would have shown when acquiring a failing shipping company. It was simply a debt being settled. Ilera received the news not as a proposal, but as a verdict. Her father, a man she had only ever seen as a gentle scholar, couldn't meet her eyes as he explained the arrangement. The words he used were soft, evasive. A companion, a temporary arrangement, to save us. But the reality of it was a sharp, brutal thing that lodged in her throat. She saw the utter devastation in his face, the shame that had hollowed him out, and in that moment, her own horror was eclipsed by the crushing weight of her duty. She was the final page in their family's long, sad story, the sacrifice required to keep the book from closing forever. Her agreement was not spoken. It was a single, slow nod, a gesture that severed her from the life she knew and turned her into a living commodity. The car that came for her was a sleek black sedan, an obsidian scar on the familiar cobblestones of her street. It was utterly silent, its presence an intrusion from a world of ruthless efficiency she couldn't comprehend. With a single small suitcase containing a few simple dresses and the worn copy of Wolf that had become her talisman, Ilera stepped out of the scent of old paper and into the sterile, leather-scented interior of the vehicle. The journey through Boston was a blur of disconnected images, the vibrant life of the city passing by her window like a film she was no longer part of. The ascent in the private glass-walled elevator was dizzying, a silent, rapid climb that felt less like going up and more like being removed from the earth itself, delivered to the rarefied, airless realm of a modern god. Stepping into the penthouse was like stepping into a void. The first thing that struck her was the silence, a perfect, manufactured emptiness that absorbed all sound. The second was the cold, a chill that radiated from the polished marble floors and the vast panes of glass that served as walls. It was a space designed to impress, not to comfort, a gallery curated to display power. Priceless sculptures stood on pedestals like silent sentinels, and abstract paintings bled color onto stark white walls. There was no clutter, no sign of life, no scent of food or coffee or dust, only the faint, chemical smell of clean. She felt like a stray particle of dust in a hermetically sealed chamber, a fragile, organic flaw in a world of hard, perfect surfaces. This was not a home. It was a mausoleum for a life not yet lived. He emerged not from a grand doorway but from the deep shadows of a long corridor, his form resolving itself into a man of stark, severe angles. Julian Thorne was taller than she had imagined, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was a mask of cold neutrality, his features handsome but devoid of warmth, as if carved from the same marble as his floors. But it was his eyes that held her captive, a pale, chilling gray, the color of a winter sky before a storm. They were eyes that didn't see people but assessed them, cataloging weaknesses and calculating value. He moved with a predatory grace, his stillness a coiled spring of immense power. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He simply stood there, his presence consuming all the oxygen in the vast, empty room. Their first exchange was not a conversation. It was the establishment of terms. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, resonant baritone, as devoid of emotion as the rest of him. "You are here for 1 month," he stated, his gaze sweeping over her once, a quick, dismissive appraisal. "Your room is that way. You will not enter my private wing. You will be silent unless I speak to you. You will touch nothing without my express permission." The words were clipped, precise, the commands of a man accustomed to absolute obedience. Ilara felt a tremor of fear, but also a surge of something else, a stubborn, quiet defiance. She said nothing, her own silence, her only weapon. She simply met his gaze for a fleeting second, holding it just long enough to let him know she was a person, not an object, before lowering her eyes. He had expected supplication. He had anticipated tears, a frightened trembling, the broken spirit of a girl sold to pay her father's debts. He received none of it. Julian Thorne watched her, intrigued by the subtle rigidity of her posture, the way her chin remained level despite the terror he knew she must be feeling. He saw the flicker of something intelligent and analytical in her moss-green eyes, a quiet perception that was both unnerving and unexpected. She was not the simple, pliant creature he had acquired. For Ilara, looking at him was like observing a magnificent panther behind glass. She was terrified of its power, aware of the danger, but she couldn't deny the compelling, hypnotic beauty of the beast. In that silent, charged assessment, a dangerous, unspoken fascination took root between them. With a curt, dismissive gesture, he indicated the hallway leading to her room, turning his back on her before she had even moved, the transaction complete, the asset delivered. As Ilara walked away, the sound of her soft-soled shoes a whisper on the marble, Julian found his gaze following her. Her quiet dignity was a disruption, a soft, organic anomaly in his world of calculated, sterile perfection. She was a puzzle, and he was a man who despised unsolved equations. As she closed the door to her gilded cage, the profound silence of the penthouse rushing back in, Ilara leaned against the cold wood, her heart hammering against her ribs. Underneath the suffocating fear, a strange, terrifying thought surfaced. The monster was real, but the story of why he had become one might be the most compelling and dangerous tale she had ever encountered. The initial days in the penthouse were a study in oppressive silence. Julian was a ghost in his own home, a fleeting presence in a distant corridor, or the low hum of an unseen elevator. Ilara, feeling more like a museum piece than a person, found her sanctuary in the one room that felt alive, his library. It was a 2-story cathedral of forgotten knowledge, filled with the familiar, comforting scent of leather and aging paper. She would spend hours there, running her fingers over the spines of books that had not been touched in years, feeling a kinship with their silent, patient waiting. From the security monitors in his office, Julian would watch her, a small, quiet figure lost among the towering shelves. He saw not a captive, but a scholar, her reverence for the objects he owned, a strange and unsettling counterpoint to his own sterile possession of them. Her first act of quiet rebellion was not defiance, but a return to herself. In a dark, forgotten corner of the library, she found a collection of Renaissance poetry, its vellum cover cracked and its spine threatening to disintegrate. Without asking permission, she located a small, unused desk and began the painstaking process of restoration. The familiar tools in her hands, the precise, meditative work of mending what was broken, became her anchor in this cold, unfamiliar sea. It was an act of reclamation, a way to carve out a small piece of this gilded cage and make it her own. She wasn't just fixing a book. She was mending her own fractured spirit, proving to herself that her skills, her very identity, could not be bought or owned, even if her presence here had been. She was a restorer, and here she would restore. One night, long after the city lights had painted streaks across the vast windows, Julian found her there. He entered the library so silently she didn't notice him at first. Her focus absolute, a magnifying lamp casting a warm, golden circle on her delicate work. He stood in the shadows for a long time, watching the methodical, almost loving way her fingers worked, breathing life back into the fragile pages. He had bought and sold entire libraries without ever considering the soul of a single volume. To him, they were assets, investments. But watching her, he saw something else entirely. A conversation across centuries, a sacred act of preservation. The intensity of her concentration, the sheer, unadulterated passion for her craft, was a force of nature he had never encountered within these sterile walls. It was quiet, yet it was deafening. He finally broke the silence, his voice a low rumble that made her jump. "What are you doing?" It was not an accusation, but a question of genuine, cold curiosity. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, but when she looked up, her voice was steady, infused with the authority of her craft. "The spine is compromised, and the pages are suffering from acid degradation. I'm deacidifying the most damaged sections and reinforcing the binding with Japanese paper." She explained the process in simple, technical terms, her fear momentarily eclipsed by her expertise. He listened without interruption, his gaze shifting from her face to her hands, to the wounded book. For the first time, he was not assessing her value, but the value of her work, and he found himself utterly, inexplicably captivated by her knowledge. This became their unspoken ritual. Each night he would find his way to the library, sometimes with a glass of whiskey in hand, and watch her work. The questions continued, evolving from the technical to the philosophical. They spoke of the poets themselves, of the historical context of the texts, of the stories behind the stories. In this vast room, surrounded by the ghosts of authors long dead, the power dynamic between them began to blur. He was the master of this domain, but she was its caretaker, its high priestess. The chasm of their arrangement was momentarily bridged by a shared intellectual curiosity. He found himself speaking to her of things he had not discussed with anyone in years, his cold, corporate mask chipping away to reveal glimpses of a man who had once loved history, a man who had once been capable of passion. One evening, as she described the tooling on a rare 16th-century binding, she pointed to a detail on a book just out of her reach on a high shelf. Without a word, Julian stepped behind her, his body heat a sudden, shocking presence at her back. He reached over her, his arm brushing against her shoulder, and retrieved the heavy volume. As he handed it down to her, their fingers touched for a fleeting, electric second. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a jolt through Alara's entire body, a warmth that spread through her veins like a fever. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her breath catching in her throat. Julian's expression was unreadable, a mask of cold neutrality, but she saw a muscle twitch in his jaw before he turned away, the charged silence in the room suddenly thick and suffocating. This accidental touch became a turning point for Alara, a moment that crystallized the terrifying conflict raging within her. The man who had bought her, the monster who held her captive, had a mind that fascinated her, and a presence that was beginning to feel less like a threat and more like a dangerous magnetic pull. A deep, sickening wave of guilt washed over her. She was here as payment for a debt, a physical manifestation of her family's shame. To feel anything for him, curiosity, sympathy, or this terrifying, fluttering warmth, felt like the ultimate betrayal of herself. She was validating the terms of her own degradation, becoming a willing participant in her own objectification. Each night she spent with him in the library felt like a slow, seductive surrender, and she hated herself for the part of her that craved it. Julian, too, was caught in an unfamiliar tide. He had designed his life to be free of emotional complications, a series of calculated transactions that left no room for vulnerability. Alara Vance was meant to be the simplest transaction of all, a beautiful, silent object to occupy his home for a month. Yet, she was anything but silent. Her quiet intelligence, her fierce dedication to her craft, and the unnerving way she saw past his fortune to the emptiness beneath, had become a profound disruption. He found himself altering his schedule, ending meetings early, just for the possibility of their late-night conversations. He was drawn to the warmth of her lamplight and the cavernous darkness of his home. He was a man who prided himself on control, yet he was losing control, drawn to the one person he was supposed to own. The fragile truce of the library was shattered when he informed her of the dinner party. "I'm hosting investors tomorrow night," he stated. his tone once again that of a CEO issuing a directive. "You will be present. You will wear the dress I provide. You will be charming. And you will be silent." The words were like a slap, a brutal reminder of her true position. She was not his intellectual equal. She was an accessory, a part of the decor to be displayed alongside his art and his expensive furniture. The warmth that had begun to bloom in her chest turned to ice. The humiliation was a physical thing, a bitter taste in her mouth. She had allowed herself to forget what she was, and he had just reminded her with a cold, casual cruelty that stole the air from her lungs. The dress was laid out on her bed, a creation of deep emerald silk that felt like water against her skin. It was beautiful, elegant, and utterly alien. Putting it on felt like shedding her own identity and donning a costume. As she looked at her reflection, she saw a stranger, a polished, beautiful woman who bore no resemblance to the quiet book restorer in ink-stained clothes. The dress was a cage as much as the penthouse was, designed to shape her into something palatable and pleasing for his world. Julian's brief, approving nod when he saw her was devoid of the warmth she had seen in the library. It was the look of a man appraising an asset that was performing to specification. She walked beside him into the living area, her spine rigid, her soul screaming in silent protest. The party was a blur of false smiles, air kisses, and conversations that skimmed the surface of everything, deep as a puddle. The guests, men in sharp suits and women dripping with jewels, looked at Ilara with a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. They saw a beautiful young woman on the arm of a powerful man and drew their own sordid conclusions. They spoke around her and through her, their questions directed at Julian about his latest acquisition, their gazes sliding over her as if she were a particularly lovely lamp. Ilara felt a profound sense of dislocation, an invisible wall separating her from these people. She was a ghost at the feast, her silence a cloak of invisibility, the clinking of their champagne glasses, a sound from a world she would never belong to. The breaking point came when one of the investors, a pompous man named Marcus, gestured dismissively at a large, chaotic, abstract painting on the wall. "I never understood why you bought this piece, Julian." He laughed. "It looks like something a child could have made, a meaningless mess." Ilara, who had spent an afternoon studying the painting and the artist's tragic history, felt a surge of indignation. Before she could stop herself, her voice, quiet but clear, cut through the chatter. "It's not meaningless," she said, her gaze fixed on the painting. It was painted by Anya Petrova the year after she escaped the Gulag. The chaos represents the psychological fragmentation of trauma, but the single line of yellow is her symbol for the stubborn persistence of hope. A stunned, immediate silence fell over the dinner table. Marcus's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The other guests stared, their champagne glasses frozen halfway to their lips. They were shocked not just by the correction, but by the fact that the silent ornament on Julian's arm had spoken with such passion and authority. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest, certain she had crossed an unforgivable line. She risked a glance at Julian, expecting to see cold fury in his eyes. Instead, she saw something she had never seen before. A flicker of raw, undisguised astonishment, followed by something else, something fiercely protective and dangerously close to pride. He was not looking at her as an asset. He was looking at her as a woman who had just defended the soul of his art. In that moment, Julian saw with blinding clarity how they all perceived her, a purchased plaything, a temporary amusement, and it filled him with a cold, unfamiliar rage. He had put her on display, and he had allowed these shallow, vapid people to diminish her. The intellectual connection he felt with her in the library was real, and he had just betrayed it for the sake of business. With a quiet, lethal finality, he placed his napkin on the table. "I believe the evening is over," he said, his voice soft but laced with an unmistakable edge of steel. He stood, his gaze sweeping over his bewildered guests, a silent command that sent them scrambling for their coats. He had never ended a business dinner so abruptly in his life. He didn't care. After the last guest had departed, the silence that descended on the penthouse was heavier and more charged than ever before. Ilara stood frozen by the table, her hands clenched at her sides, waiting for the inevitable explosion. She had disobeyed a direct order. She had embarrassed him. He walked slowly towards her, his face an unreadable mask, and for a terrifying second, she thought he might strike her. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He looked down at her, his gray eyes searching her face, and the cold mask of the tycoon finally, irrevocably, cracked. The silence stretched, filled with the thousand things they had never said, the thousand feelings they had never acknowledged. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently push a stray strand of hair from her face, his fingers barely grazing her temple. The touch was so light, so hesitant, it was more intimate than a kiss. "You were magnificent," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. It was not a compliment on her appearance or her behavior. It was an admission, a raw acknowledgement of her spirit, her intelligence, her fire. It was the first time he had ever truly seen her. Elara Vance, the restorer of lost things, and not the girl who was payment for a debt. The words, and the profound vulnerability with which he spoke them, shattered the last of her defenses, leaving her completely exposed. Elara looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes, blurring the image of the powerful man before her. The dilemma that had been tearing her apart was no longer a simple equation of desire versus duty. He had defended her. He had seen her. The desire she felt was no longer a shameful secret, but a powerful, terrifying force, mirrored in the raw emotion she now saw in his eyes. To surrender to it now would not be a submission to the terms of their contract, but a mutual surrender to something far more dangerous and real that had grown between them in the silent, lonely hours. She was standing on the edge of a precipice, and for the first time in her life she felt a dizzying, terrifying urge to jump, to let go of control and fall. His words, a raw, quiet whisper in the echoing silence, were the key that turned the lock on a part of her soul she never knew was imprisoned. "You were magnificent." A wave of something hot and overwhelming crashed through Elara, breaking down the carefully constructed walls of duty, fear, and self-preservation she had lived behind for so long. Tears, hot and immediate, welled in her eyes, not of sorrow or relief, but of a profound, shattering recognition. He had seen her, not the payment, not the companion, not the quiet girl in the library, but the fierce, intelligent spirit she had kept so carefully hidden. The vast, cold penthouse shrank until it was only the charged space between them, the distant city lights blurring into a constellation of forgotten stars. In his astonished gaze, she saw her own reflection, and for the first time, she did not feel lost. Julian watched her tears fall, and each one felt like a drop of acid on the icy armor around his heart. He, a man who moved markets and dismantled corporations with cold, surgical precision, was utterly disarmed by the silent grief and gratitude warring in her expression. This was the messy, unpredictable human emotion he had spent a lifetime avoiding, and it was more powerful than any force he had ever encountered. His instinct, honed by years of betrayal, screamed at him to retreat, to re-establish the distance, to dismiss her with a check and a cold word. But he couldn't. Her quiet strength had become the new center of gravity in his empty universe. His hand, which had only meant to brush away a stray piece of hair, now moved with a will of its own, rising to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking her tear-streaked cheek with a tenderness that felt alien and terrifyingly right. The warmth of his palm against her skin was a revelation. It was not the touch of an owner, but of a seeker, a man reaching across an impossible chasm. And in that moment, Elara made a choice. She did not pull back. She did not flinch. Instead, with a soft, shuddering breath, she leaned into his touch. A complete and total surrender to the dangerous, beautiful thing that had grown between them in the silent hours. This was her transgression. It was a betrayal of the promise she made to herself to remain untouched, to endure this arrangement with her spirit intact. But she realized now that her spirit was not being broken, it was being awakened. The scent of him, a clean, masculine scent mixed with the faint, expensive aroma of whiskey, filled her senses, and she closed her eyes, committing this single, perfect moment to memory, regardless of what came after. Seeing her eyes close, he mistook her surrender for fear. His own heart was a wild, foreign drum against his ribs, and the unfamiliar vulnerability made him clumsy. "Elara," he began, his voice hoarse, the sound swallowed by the vast room. "You don't have to." He was offering her an escape, a retreat to the cold, simple terms of their contract, because it was the only language he knew. He started to pull his hand away, to sever the connection that was threatening to undo him completely. But before he could, her own small ink-stained hand flew up, covering his, pressing his palm more firmly against her cheek. Her eyes opened, and they were no longer filled with tears, but with a fierce, unwavering fire. "Don't," she whispered, the word a fragile command, and in that single, breathless syllable she claimed him, turning the master into the captive. Her command was the final fissure that shattered his world. He looked down at her, at the woman who had just forbidden him from retreating into his own fortress, and he saw everything. He saw the shy scholar, the fierce defender, the lonely soul, and the passionate woman, all of it swirling in the moss-green depths of her eyes. And he knew, with a certainty that terrified and exhilarated him, that he was utterly lost. He was no longer Julian Thorne, the vulture, the master of a sterile empire. He was a man drowning, and she was his only breath. He leaned down, his forehead coming to rest against hers, their breaths mingling, the last barrier between them. "You are destroying me," he murmured against her skin, and it was not an accusation. It was a confession, a prayer of gratitude for the beautiful, terrifying ruin she was making of his life. The kiss was not gentle. It was a desperate, hungry collision, a frantic testament to weeks of stolen glances, unspoken words, and the unbearable tension that had simmered between them in the quiet of the library. It was the release of a lifetime of loneliness, a raw, explosive expression of a need so profound neither of them had dared to name it. His mouth claimed hers with a desperate urgency, but beneath the force was a tremor of profound vulnerability, the touch of a man starved for a connection he believed he could never have. Ilara met his desperation with her own, her response immediate and fierce. A lifetime of passion, saved only for the heroes in her books, poured into this single shattering act, her hands gripping his shoulders as if he were her only anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. The kiss was a story in itself, a frantic narrative of pain and longing. With every movement he spoke of his isolation, of the betrayal that had frozen his heart. She answered with her own quiet solitude, with the deep, aching need to be truly seen. The emerald silk of her dress, a symbol of the role he had forced her to play, suddenly felt like a suffocating lie. He broke the kiss, his chest heaving, his gray eyes now the color of a stormy sea, dark and turbulent with emotions he could no longer control. In one fluid, powerful motion, he swept her into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. It was an act of pure possession, yet it felt like an act of worship. Ilara didn't fight. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face against his throat, breathing him in, feeling the frantic, powerful rhythm of his heart against her own. He carried her past the sterile guest room she had been assigned, past the forbidden corridor to his own private wing, and into the one place where they had truly found each other, the library. He laid her down gently on the vast, worn leather sofa that faced the wall of glass, the sleeping city a carpet of glittering jewels below them. Moonlight poured into the room, bathing them in its soft, silvery light, creating a sacred, intimate space, far from the harsh, artificial glare of his world. He brought her here, to the sanctuary of stories, the one place she had made her own, a silent acknowledgement that this was where their real story had begun. He knelt on the floor beside her, his intense gaze roaming her face not with lust, but with a kind of awestruck wonder, his eyes asking the final, unspoken question. Ilara met his gaze, her own clear and resolute. In this room, surrounded by the silent, waiting stories, she felt no fear. She was not a transaction being completed, she was a woman making a choice. This was her narrative now, and she would write this chapter herself. With slow, deliberate movements, she sat up, never breaking eye contact with him. She reached behind her, her fingers finding the small, pearl-like buttons at the nape of her neck. It was not a seductive gesture. It was an act of ultimate trust, a shedding of the last barrier between them. She was not just removing the dress he had chosen for her. She was removing the identity he had imposed upon her, revealing the true, fragile, and fiercely passionate woman who had been hiding underneath all along, offering him the one thing that had never been part of their contract, her soul. He watched her, his breath catching in his chest, his stillness a form of reverence. Her quiet act of self-revelation was the most profound and intimate thing he had ever witnessed. When her fingers fumbled with a button, he reached out, his own hands surprisingly steady, and helped her. His touch was feather-light against her skin, a stark contrast to the ferocity of their kiss, as if he were handling the most fragile and priceless of manuscripts. As the emerald silk pooled at her waist, leaving her bathed in moonlight, the last vestiges of their arrangement dissolved into the shadows. In the hallowed silence of the library, there was no millionaire and no payment. There were only Julian and Ilara, two broken, lonely souls transgressing every rule to find in each other a terrifying and beautiful salvation that would irrevocably change them both forever. The soft gray light of dawn crept into the library, a clinical observer to the aftermath of the night's storm. Ilara awoke first, disoriented, the unfamiliar weight of a cashmere blanket, a stark contrast to the thin quilt on her bed at home. She was on the sofa, and across the room, slumped in a leather armchair, was Julian. Asleep, he was stripped of his power, his face unguarded and strangely boyish, a map of exhaustion and forgotten sorrows. For a fleeting, hopeful moment, the intimacy they had shared felt real, a tangible thing she could hold on to. But as the sun rose higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor, the library ceased to be their sanctuary. It felt like a crime scene, and the silence was heavy with the weight of a beautiful, terrible transgression that could never be undone. He stirred as the light touched his face, his eyes fluttering open. They found her immediately, and for a single, unguarded second, she saw the man from the night before, the raw, vulnerable soul who had confessed she was destroying him. A soft, questioning look crossed his features. But then, as if a switch had been flipped, the mask of Julian Thorne slammed back into place. His jaw tightened, his eyes turned to cold, polished steel, and he sat up, straightening his crumpled shirt with brisk, efficient movements. The man who had held her with such desperate tenderness was gone, replaced by the ruthless tycoon. He stood and walked to the far side of the room, the deliberate distance he put between them, a physical manifestation of the emotional wall he was rapidly rebuilding, brick by terrifying brick. His voice, when it came, was devoid of any warmth, as sterile as the glass walls around them. "The arrangement is concluded." He spoke the words to the window, not to her. He then moved to the antique desk in the corner, a piece of furniture they had once discussed for an hour, admiring its history. Now, he opened a drawer with a sharp, definitive click. He pulled out a checkbook. The sound of his pen scratching across the paper was obscenely loud in the quiet room, a brutal, clinical noise that systematically erased every soft whisper, every desperate kiss, every shared breath of the night before. He tore the check from the book with a violent rip, walked back, and placed it on the low table in front of her, a white rectangle of pure, unadulterated insult. It was a severance, a payment, a gag order. Ilara stared at the check, the ink still seeming to bleed on the paper, then slowly lifted her gaze to his face. She searched his eyes for any flicker of the man she had given herself to, but found nothing. Only the vulture remained, cold, calculating, and utterly remote. The heartbreak was not a gentle sorrow. It was a physical blow that hollowed out her chest and stole the air from her lungs. But tears would be a victory for him, a confirmation of her weakness. Instead, a cold, quiet dignity she never knew she possessed settled over her. She rose from the sofa, pulling the expensive blanket around her shoulders like a queen's mantle. Without a single word, she turned her back on him, on the check, on the beautiful, terrible lie of the library, and walked away, her bare feet making no sound on the cold marble floor. The descent in the private elevator felt like a journey back from a distant, dangerous planet. Stepping out onto the Boston street in the hazy morning light, barefoot and wrapped in a billionaire's blanket, she was an apparition, a ghost of a girl who no longer belonged anywhere. The bookshop, when she finally arrived, was shrouded in a familiar, suffocating silence. Her parents were waiting, their faces a relief map of guilt and anxious fear. They asked no questions. They didn't have to. They saw the answer in the profound, shattered stillness of her eyes, in the way she carried herself not like their daughter, but like a stranger who had seen too much. The home she had sacrificed herself to save no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a tomb, and she was the ghost destined to haunt it. In the days that followed, the weight of their unspoken shame was a constant presence in the small apartment. Her mother's attempts at comfort, a cup of tea, a favorite meal, were laced with a sharp, pitying edge that felt more like judgment. Her father, the man whose honor she had fought to preserve, could no longer meet her gaze. He would retreat into the depths of the shop, his slumped shoulders a constant, agonizing reminder of the price she had paid for his weakness. Ilara was more alone than she had ever been, isolated not by shyness, but by an experience they could never comprehend. Their silence was not a comfort. It was a confirmation of her deepest fear, that in their eyes, she was no longer their daughter, but a tainted object, a living receipt for their salvation. Julian, meanwhile, was a prisoner in his own sterile fortress. After she left, the silence of the penthouse had returned with a vengeance, no longer a comfortable emptiness but a deafening, accusing void. Every polished surface reflected his solitude. The library was a place of torment, the scent of her still clinging to the leather sofa, a phantom presence that mocked him at every turn. He had reverted to his old self, the cold, transactional predator, believing it would protect him. Instead, it had damned him. He had successfully pushed away the only flicker of genuine warmth he had felt in a decade, and the resulting desolation was a punishment far more severe than the controlled loneliness he had curated for himself. He was the king of an empty, meaningless empire. Ilara returned to her workshop, seeking solace in the familiar rituals of her craft. But the books, once her only friends, now felt like strangers. Their tales of love and loss were muted, faded copies of the vibrant, devastating reality she had just experienced. A deep, gnawing guilt consumed her. She felt used, discarded, and profoundly foolish for allowing herself to believe that a connection born from such a sordid contract could ever be real. The memory of his final, cold transaction, the check offered as payment for her body and her soul, played on a loop in her mind. She feared she had traded the most sacred, untouched part of herself for a lie, that she had allowed him to destroy her for nothing. But beneath the crushing weight of heartbreak and humiliation, a new, unfamiliar feeling began to stir. It was a tiny, defiant ember of strength. She had walked into the lion's den and had not been devoured. She had faced the monster and had found, however briefly, the wounded man inside. The experience, as brutal as its ending was, had irrevocably changed her. She was no longer the fragile, timid girl preserved under glass. She had been shattered, yes, but the pieces were reforming into something harder, stronger, and more resilient. Looking at her own reflection in the dark window one night, she saw not a victim, but a survivor, a woman forged in a fire she had never asked for, but had endured. She picked up her tools, her hands steady for the first time in days. She found the most hopelessly damaged book in the shop, a volume whose spine was completely severed, its pages a chaotic, crumbling mess. Restoring it was no longer an escape, but an act of reclamation. With each delicate suture of paper, with each careful application of glue, she was not just mending a book, she was mending herself. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and electrifying, that her story with Julian Thorne was not over. It was not a contract to be fulfilled and filed away. It was a deep, shared wound. He had tried to close it with money, but she knew that a wound this profound could only be healed with truth, or it would fester until it consumed them both. A month bled into the next, a quiet passage of time marked by the changing slant of light in her workshop. Ilara had found a new rhythm, a solitary peace that was different from the one she had known before. It was not the peace of confinement, but the quiet strength of self-possession. She had taken the shattered pieces of her experience and was slowly, meticulously, building a new version of herself, one with harder edges and a clearer gaze. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a simple, flat cardboard box arrived with irregular mail. It bore no corporate logo, no courier stamp, only her name, written in a stark, familiar script that made her breath catch in her throat. Her hands, so steady these past weeks, trembled as she held it. It was a ghost from a life she was trying to forget, a question she was terrified to answer. She carried the box upstairs to her workshop, the one place that was unequivocally hers, and set it on her workbench. For a long moment, she simply stared at it, a Pandora's box of memory and potential pain. With a deep, fortifying breath, she sliced the tape with her restoration knife. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was the Renaissance poetry collection, the book she had been mending in his library. But it was unfinished. The spine was still exposed, the sections of pages waiting for the final, binding stitch. It was a broken thing, deliberately sent back to its restorer, a silent, desperate message that transcended words. It was not a gift of wealth, but an offering of shared vulnerability, a confession that he too was incomplete, a story left hanging in the middle of a sentence, waiting for her to turn the page. Tucked between the fragile vellum pages was a single, thick sheet of cream-colored paper. She unfolded it to find only 7 words written in that same severe, controlled hand. "I cannot finish this story alone." It was not an apology. It was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a raw, stripped-down admission of failure from a man who had built an empire on the illusion of his own infallibility. The words were a perfect, devastating echo of the feeling that had haunted her since she'd left his penthouse. Their story had been violently truncated, a beautiful, complex narrative torn in half. He wasn't trying to buy his way back. He was admitting he didn't know how to write the ending. He was handing her the pen, acknowledging that the power to complete their narrative had always been hers. Elara walked to the window, the book in one hand, the note in the other, and looked down at the familiar cobblestone street. The world outside had not changed, but her place within it had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer the girl who was sold, a passive character in someone else's drama. She was a woman who had faced a monster and found a man who had been broken and was now healing herself. She could finish the book, package it, and mail it back, a final, professional transaction that would sever their connection forever. Or she could understand the book for what it was, a bridge, painstakingly constructed from the only materials he knew she would trust. It was an invitation not back to his world, but to meet him in the space between, in the shared language of broken, beautiful things waiting to be made whole. Her decision was not made with a word or a letter. It was a quiet, deliberate action. She returned to her workbench and gently set aside the hopelessly damaged book she had been using to mend her own spirit. In its place, she set down the Renaissance poetry. She threaded a new needle with a long, strong piece of linen cord, the familiar ritual, a balm to her racing heart. Her hands, which had trembled only moments before, were now perfectly steady, infused with a newfound sense of purpose. She was not accepting his terms or surrendering to his world. She was taking control of the narrative, agreeing to finish their story, but on her own ground, in her own time. It was a powerful, silent answer, a reclamation of her own agency in a story she was now ready to co-author. The last rays of the afternoon sun spilled across her workbench, bathing the book and her hands in a warm, golden light. As she took the first careful, precise stitch, binding the disparate pages into a unified whole, she felt a profound sense of peace. The future was unwritten, a blank page filled with uncertainty and the lingering shadows of their painful beginning. It would not be easy. Restoring something so deeply damaged never was. But for the first time since she had walked out of his life, it felt possible. In the quiet solitude of her sanctuary, she was not just mending a book. She was mending a bond, weaving a new ending for 2 lonely souls. If their story has touched your heart, and you want to believe in the power of second chances, subscribe, like, share, and comment to let us know you're with us on this journey.